you everyone, and welcome to our IAM webinar today. It's all around ISO 55011, and it's part of a set of webinars we've been doing to try and help understand and promote the new ISO documents that were published over the past few months. I'm delighted today to be joined by Tiffany and Kerry, but just before I hand over to them, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be collecting questions for Tiffany and Kerry during the presentation, and it will be in slido.com, and the code is 3066564, and I will make sure I put that in the chat. So please pop your questions into Slido. You can also vote them up. So that will give us an idea of the most popular questions that we can ask Tiffany and Kerry to have a look at the end of the presentation. So I'm delighted to hand over now to Tiffany and Kerry. Thank you so much for doing this webinar. I'll be on with you later when we're looking at questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ursula, and thank you so much to the Institute of Asset Management and the team there for inviting us to speak with you all here today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Again, my name is Tiffany Batac, and I'm joined here with Professor Kerry Brown. We are part of the convener team for the development of ISO 55011. Shall we go ahead and get started? Let me know if you can see my screen here. Okay. All right. So I'm not able to see anything else on my screen. So if anyone cannot hear or see me, please do shout. What we'd like to do today is provide you with an introduction to the International Organization for Standardization and TC 251, otherwise known as Technical Committee 251, focused on asset management, and the 55,000 series for those of you who might be new to that, and provide a little bit of context for 55,011 and the development of that. We'll get into more of the details of 55,011, what you can expect in terms of the content, some of the actions and considerations depending on the different backgrounds you might have and the benefits. We will have some time to get into an example case study application. We'll leave you with some resources and, of course, open it up for any questions you might have. So, an introduction to the International Organization for Standardization, otherwise known as ISO. It is a worldwide network of national standardization bodies currently representing 172 countries and responsible for developing and publishing international standards, really bringing together experts from all over the world in a consensus to develop consensus-based voluntary standards. At present, there are over 25,000 international standards and related publications focused on a variety of areas from product and services, safety, and of course, management systems, which 55,001 is part of that. There are 800 technical committees and subcommittees at present, and TC 251 is just one of those. The Technical Committee 251, focused on asset management, which I just mentioned previously, is responsible for that 55,000 series. Many of you are probably aware of the first iteration of the standard that was published in 2014. A little bit, almost 10 years ago, we had 37 countries involved in the development of those standards, and we've grown quite a bit. So we now are up to 59 countries involved directly in the development of the 55,000 series standard. For those of you who might be new to the TC 251 structure and process, This just provides you a little bit of an overview of the process from start to finish. Each standard or other work product starts with what we call an NWIP. It's a new work item proposal that must be approved by the technical committee internationally. It goes through several stages, from working drafts to committee drafts to a draft international standard stage, to then the final draft international standard phase before publication. It's typically about a 3-year or so process from start to finish. And where we are prior to actually 2014 with regard to the 55,000 series of standards, there were 4 main standards that were developed between 2014 and 2019, as you see here. The overview, principles, and terminology, the introduction for the 55,000 series, and then we have 55,001, which is focused on the management system requirements, and this is the standard that you would certify against. 55,002, which is focused on guidelines for the application of ISO 55001, and then 55,010, which is a technical specification focus on the alignment of asset management, finance, and accounting. Now, today, this year, 2024, quite a bit has been updated. So those same standards that we just looked at have been updated since, and there are also 3 new standards in the series. I think this table here summarizes it quite well. So we have the first iteration of the 55,000, 55,001, and 55,002 international standards. The first iteration about 10 years ago, we go through a systematic review process in which we review and update according to relevancy and feedback over about every 10 years. And so the version 2 of 55,000 and 55,001 are out as of July this year. And along with 55,010, we do have the first iterations of 55,011, which we'll talk about in more detail today, 55,012 focused on people involvement and competence, and 55,013 focused on data for asset management. As Ursula had mentioned, as this is one of a series of webinars to provide more information on the international standards and the updates, I do want to just point out that there are other recordings that provide an overview of the full suite of standards and what's new this year compared to 2014, as well as some of the other new standards as well. The latest update is anticipated in 2026, and that one will be the update to 55,002, which is the guidance on implementation of 55,001. Okay, now the 55,000 series. Another way to look at it is that the 55,000 document provides the why, and the what you need to do and the requirements is 55,001. And the how you do that is through 55,002, 10, 12, and 13. These are all primarily focused internally within an organization. And 55,011 is the standard that focuses external to the organization and the relationships to advance asset management within a jurisdiction. Now, as shown on the previous slide, most of the 55,000 series of standards help organizations implement asset management systems to achieve their own objectives. There wasn't previously guidance that helped organizations or individuals work with other organizations, whether they're government or non-government, to adopt or advance asset management in which they may rely on to achieve their objectives. So those of us in the international asset management community have long recognized the contribution that a structured approach to asset management, such as that codified in the ISO 55000 series of standards, can make for achieving organizational goals. Several countries have recognized this even before 55000 was first published in 2014 and began passing laws and or regulations that required the adoption of asset management practices in infrastructure sectors that they consider to be critical to their national interests, mainly water, energy, and transportation. This standard does build on the lessons learned from those countries and responds to global demand as confirmed through a 2020 survey, which we'll talk about in just a bit, for such guidance on how public policies can advance the adoption of asset management across many organizations to achieve national or subnational goals. A little bit of background and context. So the idea was first proposed in 2016. So again, going back to that process map that we had about ISO and the technical committee structure. We had our first NWIP, or New Work Item Proposal, which was approved in 2016, which led to the approval and launch of a new working group, which is Working Group 7 in 2017, focused on public policy, and then the development of what is now known as 55011. In the first years of its conception, as you can imagine, trying to develop a global standard for public policy has had its own challenges, especially given that the functions of government and methods of formulating public policies vary from country to country. Yet what we found was that common guidance, even if the system and the organizations of government are different, they were reported by survey to still be useful. And so it was really a multi-year effort by Working Group 7 members to conduct research, including conducting firsthand interviews with government leaders and public policy officials, testing and validating new concepts in the market, including this new concept that we've introduced in 55011 called the enabling environment for asset management. And of course, refining the scope, target audience, and design of the new standard in the first several years. As part of this effort, we did gather input from those who were involved with government on the challenges they face relating to the delivery of public services. And we determined if those who develop, administer, and or influence the formation of public policy could benefit from guidance that may enhance their existing public policy. And we obtained input on what type of guidance would help promote or enable asset management, especially related to specific public policy instruments or applicable public policy documents. In fact, 85% of our survey respondents back in 2020 had mentioned that the case studies and examples were something that would be of great value in terms of the how certain public policy instruments were developed or applied. So that is something that you'll see that has realized in the content itself. So 55011, we're now in 2024, and it's been published as of August of this year. It really responds to that global demand, providing guidance based on the leading practices and the lessons learned internationally over those several years for the development of public policy that enables multiple organizations and levels of government to adopt, align, and or advance asset management within their jurisdictions. And it's intended for all types of governments as well. So what ISO 55011 is and is not. While ISO 55000 55001 and 55002 make reference to organizational policy. ISO 55011 refers to public policy. The focus of this document is on providing guidance on establishing, sustaining, and improving an enabling environment for asset management through public policy. It can really aid in the choice and development of public policy instruments that promote the adoption of asset management for multiple organizations, again, within countries or jurisdictions at all levels of government. So not just focusing internally within a single organization, but your relationship with other organizations and how you might be able to work together to advance the practice and achieve those national or subnational goals. The other thing that ISO 55011 does, it is intended to help a broad range of users understand their roles or potential roles as participants in this enabling environment and the actions that you can take and the benefits in doing so. So who is it for? So we've mentioned it's intended for both government and non-government audiences, really broadly to cover both individuals and organizations. For example, under the government side, it could be government officials at all levels of government who want to achieve objectives that depend on the effective management of physical assets owned or operated by public and or private sector organizations within their respective jurisdictions. And examples of some of those objectives might include adequate levels of public services across all infrastructure sectors that are safe, resilient, sustainable, and affordable, or they may be interested in achieving their commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And out of the non-government side, it could be asset management professionals or groups seeking to advance asset management across multiple organizations, but it really can cover many others as well, whether you're from academia or other organizations. Now, in terms of the content, if you can see the outline here on the left-hand side, I did mention that it does introduce a new concept for the enabling environment for asset management. The standard itself includes some good visuals that I think are helpful in terms of breaking down and describing key elements of this environment and the relationships. This concept is similar to the context of an individual organization that consists of conditions created by its stakeholders. It applies to multiple organizations within political jurisdictions and the conditions created by their stakeholders and others. And for those who are familiar with ISO 55001, 55011 broadens the concept of stakeholders, of individual organizations, to the concept of participants in enabling environment for asset management. So it includes stakeholders who enable the adoption of asset management in individual organizations, as well as other entities not perceived by organizations as stakeholders. It identifies government participants who can issue and implement public policies as separate from non-government participants who might be able to influence the policymaking processes to advance asset management. It goes into more detail about the different roles that a variety of participants can play in developing or influencing the development of public policies to enable asset management and what some of those good practices are, including providing frameworks for effective public investment. And with regard to the public policy development specifically, the standard provides a menu of options, including considerations for existing, new, or updated policy instruments and mechanisms, covering everything from mandatory instrument types such as laws or regulations to voluntary or incentive-based instrument types, such as financial incentives or capacity building programs, etc., that can be coordinated as part of an overall policy mix that support the overall advancement of asset management and whether it could be national or subnational objectives. In fact, there were over 20 different policy instruments and types that were identified and are detailed in the standard. We try to develop a flexible framework that offers tailoring to your own jurisdiction's unique needs and context. Detailed case studies and examples are included from other countries, including what policy instruments were developed and or applied, how, and the benefits and lessons learned. The standard includes case studies, for example, from Canada, from Japan, Portugal, and Australia, with more underway. And I would like to pass it over to my colleague, Professor Kerry Brown, to talk a little bit more about some of the benefits of ISO 55011 and walk through some of the benefits that have been realized and findings of another case study that's supplementary to the case studies included in the standard itself. Over to you, Kerry.
Thank you. So when we look at the benefits of ISO 5511, we are focusing on this enabling environment for asset management. And so by creating, sustaining, and improving that enabling environment for asset management, we can align government objectives at different levels of administration and in public service providers, and so that achieving national goals is one way of moving towards the success. So we're looking at how to foster and develop partnerships through ISO 5511, and that's around understanding the way in which the policy levers can be brought together to understand and promote good asset management. We also suggest that ISO 5511 and the work, we've just lost it, Tiffany, and the work of making better use of financial and non-financial resources is exemplified in this. We're also looking at the long term and improving decision making over that long term. We're also suggesting that there will be an improvement in transparency, accountability, and better risk management in those decisions and associated actions, particularly in regard to critical infrastructure. And so it allows a flexible suite of policy instruments to be deployed to be able to achieve objectives. And as part of all of the ISO standards, it's built on continuous improvement. And so this also allows a way of being able to continually improve services and service delivery. And so what we wanted to talk about is to be able to look at a case study and the way in which policy levers can be used. And a case study is around understanding a strategic asset management framework. And we have an example of what one jurisdiction wanted to do within Australia, and that was to look at how do you develop a good practice strategic asset management framework, and what are the elements that work to achieve that successfully. And so what the project was to do was to compare across a range of jurisdictions across Australia, all of the jurisdictions which are at different levels of maturity. And so the body that organised the case study of that comparison across Australia was an independent body called Infrastructure South Australia, which was established through the Infrastructure South Australia Act in 2018. So it's quite new, and it's an independent advisory body to advise government on South Australia's infrastructure needs. And the states in Australia have a number of these infrastructure bodies, and they are as independent advisory bodies. And you can see across the jurisdictions that some of these are based in independent to the mechanisms of government through the state government, but some are embedded within. So asset management is embedded within the central agencies of government, and you'll see a swing towards these independent bodies. And what Infrastructure South Australia wanted to find out was what's best practice in identifying and evaluating strategic asset management frameworks and policies in jurisdictions across Australia, so that they could implement a best practice strategic asset management framework for South Australia. And this next slide shows you the breadth of the work that was undertaken across Australia at the state level of government. We have a federal system of government, and so the federal system is that of Australia, and the state government system is of the different states within Australia. And each of those states have certain jurisdictional requirements and legislative arrangements, and they are fairly independent within each of those jurisdictions. We also have a local government level of jurisdiction in Australia, and that takes up the regional areas. So what we wanted to look at was what are the policy levers supporting strategic asset management frameworks across Australia. And what we found was that these were used from, as Tiffany said, from the mandatory to the incentive-based to the voluntary. And so some of the success factors in some of the jurisdictions, for example, the state of New South Wales was way ahead of many of the other states in their maturity in strategic asset management framework. And what they had was an attestation framework. And what that allowed as a mandatory requirement that each department head of an agency in the New South Wales government had to sign off on asset management. And what this did was put asset management at the top of each agency and their responsibility. So the attestation was a document, a verified auditable document that each Director General had to sign off on in a mandatory response. And that really moved asset management to the top of an organisation's attention and the top of each organisation's work. And when we had a voluntary example, which was in one of the states of in Victoria and started in New South Wales as well, was a community of practice. And what this community of practice started to do was have a learning community about asset management for those who were not necessarily asset managers, but dealt with infrastructure or physical infrastructure in their department. And so what this allowed was people learning from each other, and that was completely voluntary. And it started with about 60 and ended up with 200 or 300 people who were learning and keen to learn about asset management and sharing that knowledge. And so those two examples, I think, are really important in understanding the policy mechanisms for building good practice. And so what we see is that across Australia, there are various levels of maturity, so that those who are building their asset management and the ability to achieve strategic asset management frameworks had independent infrastructure advisory agencies or agencies providing strategic advice to government on strategic asset management planning. So this change from central agencies and using budgetary arrangements to provide for infrastructure and asset management is a notable maturity level and a way to be able to highlight asset management and good practices within asset management. That there's a state infrastructure strategy, that a high-level strategy has been developed across Australia, each of the states and in fact in each of the local government areas for infrastructure strategies. And this is a very important formulation that moves higher level than just asset management plans. And it's important to build a vision and a future for asset management. Also, the states, although this one's even less of a voluntary than just a great idea. So there's no certification to the ISO standards, but you can see that each of the states were using the ISO suite of standards to be able to monitor, map, and use as a kind of a guiding principle about what they did in strategic asset management. And so you could follow that the ISO standards underpinned the work in asset management for each of the states of Australia, even if they were in their infancy. Strategic asset management framework was a way of being able to put at the highest levels of attention and government a way of understanding asset management. And it needed an integrated approach. And this is what the standards offer, that it's an integrated approach. What we had in Australia, and overall, it's considered that Australia has a fairly mature approach to asset management, that we had mandatory to voluntary, that we had a panoply of public policy instruments that were deployed to achieve asset management, and some around the budgetary considerations were quite important, and I'll talk a little bit about that. What we had in terms of the strategic positioning within agencies is that if it was central agencies, often it was just a budgetary approach, but if it was infrastructure, state government agencies, these independent infrastructure advisory agencies, they were able to support asset management and look at a more strategic view from their perspective. So it really was an important element to look at thinking through infrastructure bodies like Infrastructure South Australia or Infrastructure Western Australia, Infrastructure New South Wales. So the agency responsible for ensuring compliance and compliance arrangements to the budget and funding regimes moved around, and this is the choice of each jurisdiction. Where does it sit? And it sits where it is best placed for achieving outcomes. Sometimes it was with central agencies, sometimes it was with infrastructure independent bodies, and other times it was with the budgetary area of central agencies as well. So it moved around according to strategic need. And what we had was also mentions of, across Australia, asset management in their infrastructure strategy. So the terminology of asset management is coming into all of those policy arrangements and policy documents. There's also reference to emerging issues, but this was patchy across Australia. But really, the net zero and sustainability was one of the biggest new areas that they were considering and working with, and it was a way of adding to asset management as these new and emerging areas could be moved into. And so while they were talking about it, while they were aware of it, there was still a lot of unknown territory about how to do this. And the strategic asset management framework gave at least a perspective to that, so that there was some consideration of net zero as part of asset management, even if they hadn't grappled with it to the extent of a high level of maturity. And one of the elements that was very important, and as I mentioned, it was really around understanding that it's not just about new assets and ribbon cutting, but about making sure that there's a capital maintenance program across the long life of those assets. And what that meant was that there was consideration over the life of the asset. And some examples that we've seen in different jurisdictions and globally is that an asset is produced and the maintenance of it is not considered, or the budget for that maintenance is not considered. And this allows that to happen, that maintenance is considered across the long life of the asset. The other element is an incentivised policy, which allowed agencies to be able to re-spend or spend in priority areas their budget. Often in Australia, the June, I know other jurisdictions have different timing, but in Australia, our June rush to spend a budget before the end of the financial year means that there's often hasty decisions, let's say. But this allowed a reallocation of funding to be able to go to strategic projects or priority projects if there was a saving. And this incentive is a really important mechanism that I think is a way forward to be able to build good asset management thinking and asset management principles. So I think that the case study shows us that in differing jurisdictions, even within one country, there is a scope and ability to test out the way in which mandatory, incentivised and voluntary principles, policies can be utilised for strategically building good asset management practices and good asset management. And I'll hand over to Tiffany to finalise the presentation.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you so much, everyone. We just also wanted to leave you with some resources and how to access more about 55,011. You can access the standard directly, either through ISO online, through the link provided here, or directly through your national standards body. It is currently available in English and French and being translated in more languages. If you'd like to learn more about TC251, about the work that we're doing and the other standards, we've also included the website here. Also to note that we are continually updating the website, including for the page on 55,011, as we are continually developing case studies and other supporting material to really support the development of those public policy instruments, continuing to identify leading practices and trying to share that knowledge. So with that, I will also just mention, if you'd like to find us on LinkedIn, the link is there on the page, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Tiffany and Kerry. It's really interesting. I know Tiffany was a bit worried that we weren't going to get any questions. Do not worry, we have loads of questions. We'll just kick off. So what people have been doing is that they've been voting up the questions whilst you've been talking, as well as adding their own. So if we'll take the most popular questions, if that's okay. So Matt Haitley, and Matt's involved in the water regulator in the UK. So what can UK regulators do to enable greater asset management maturity?
Mm-hmm.
It might be worth saying, Kerry, you might know this before you dive in, but Matt's the regulator. He's probably thinking about the economic regulators. We've got a number of economic regulators, I'm sure you're aware of. So in the UK.
So I'll have a go first, and then Tiffany can follow up. I think when you're looking at asset management maturity, the way in which you're looking at is, I mean, for me, it's about delivering services. And in Australia, we look at service delivery. Does good asset management create good services and build communities? So the ability to regulate is an important element of this. And it depends whether you're regulating for you're regulating for, for the ability to incentivize or regulate for the ability to penalize in a way. And so it's choosing how to move across by bringing everyone together in a collaborative mode of I use, coming from public policy background, I use the idea of co-production. And so there's a level of expertise that needs to be supported around this, and coming to an idea about, well, what does this mean in terms of service delivery, and how important when you're thinking about safety, when you're thinking about the ability to come together and make those rules and regulations. And so for me, it's about the collaborative impact of who needs to be at the table to discuss this. How does it get across in terms of the way forward? Is it a penalising? Is it an incentivising? Or is it understanding how, to me, a strategic asset management framework is a really good starting point for that, because everything hangs from that. Your policy, your asset management policy, your way of dealing with stakeholders, your way of dealing with those within and without an organisation. So it's bringing all those players together. And it's we in Australia, we developed up a simple guide to strategic asset management maturity by just understanding how close you are to the standard. And so that really is, do you have policies? Do you have practices? Do you have understanding? And do you have an ability to deliver services? Or are you just kind of ticking boxes about all that? So that's really where that comes from, about asset management maturity.
Thank you. So the next question is, what impact do you feel it makes for governments to require the implementation of asset management for its public assets? I think people are trying to get to understand, a little bit about maybe some of the experience you've had with some of the case studies, or some of the learning you've taken through the standard in terms of this question.
It really is about an ordered way of being able to deliver services and being able to plan for the future. I mean, in Queensland, for example, we were asked to have a look at this issue because the state budget was going to be taken up 53% by health, and just by spending in the health area. And so what it means is that you're able to build a more strategic view, a prioritisation, and a way forward for the future. And they ended up thinking about, 10 to 20 years in the future. So what it does is exactly that: greater transparency of decision making, greater ability to plan for the future, and greater ability to deliver those services through the infrastructure, and use innovation as well. It's a really important set of considerations, and it seems like, how does it do that? What is it about it? But it's the process of coming together to build that framework and all the elements that come off it, which are outlined in the 55,000 suite of standards. But the public policy instruments and the enabling environment in which that happens is the additional piece of the puzzle that comes in the guidance that has been developed.
I can
The
add a little
next
bit to
question,
that as
yeah,
well. Oh, sorry,
the next,
Ursula.
yeah, the next question, Tiffany, maybe where do you see the ISO 55011 document evolve? I think people are trying to understand. Well, you've got this, so where do you what's the next step? Where people just where do they see it evolving?
Sure. I think the case studies are an area where it's continuing to evolve. Leading practices is continuously being identified. And even on the last point, some of the, whether they're requirements or even incentives, for example, some of the governments that we had interviewed were providing subsidies for the development of asset management plans or renewal plans that have been verified, and it was resulting in lower total cost of ownership in some cases. So in terms of impact and where it's evolving, I think case studies is definitely one of the areas, but we are also looking for initial feedback. This is a new standard, and as we start to get this implemented more broadly, I think that will really drive, depending on the feedback that we get, what types of improvements we'll be looking into.
Thank you. So this is a question about where do we think the standard is most useful? So the question is all around, is it most useful for influencing governments in economies with a mature asset management, or for developing countries focused on maybe new construction or a less mature in their asset management?
Tiffany, I think you could talk about this in terms of our own experience in our committee about the different maturities.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So I would say it's really a good diversity of both those who are more mature as well as those who are perhaps in a more developing area. The composition of our group and discussions have actually involved the full range. So as Kerry presented an example from Australia, a country who's more mature in asset management already, but has still found some utility in such a standard and applying it at the local levels, and where we have developing areas who are also engaged as part of the standard development and implementation of it, where they're looking at some of perhaps more of the mandatory public policy instruments around if there isn't a law or requirements. Those are some of the areas that they're looking into, in addition to the capacity building programs or training and how they are incorporating it into educational programs or universities.
And I think there was an earlier question about more case studies, and we have a number in train, and they will be published as we're able to develop those ones in Africa, another in the US. Yeah.
In South America as well, in Asia.
There's one of the slides which appears to there are only 3 member countries in Africa. I think this is going back to the ISO member countries picture you showed, Tiffany. Yeah. And how are we encouraging people to get involved? It's got the IAM, and I can talk about what we're doing with the IAM, but I think it'd just be a good idea just to give a bit of feel for how we're trying to encourage people to sort of get involved with asset management.
I can speak from a working group 7 perspective. We actually, South Africa is one of the areas that we've started to engage with and interview as part of the case study development. So in terms of the learnings and also some of the work that they've been doing in partnership with other countries like Canada, for example, that's one avenue that we've been starting to engage with them. But Ursula, maybe if you want to speak on the IAM perspective, and Kerry, if you have anything else you might like to add to that.
Yeah, I think I'll just do 2 perspectives. One, I'll do the global forum. So of course, the IM is member of the Global Forum, and we do have SAMA, which is the South African Asset Management Association, in the Global Forum. And certainly I know that SAMA have got a lot of connections within Africa, across Africa, and they engage with people within that continent. We also have a lot of engagement ourselves as an institute. So we've got members in nearly 80 countries, and we've got people from Africa who are engaged with us, and we do encourage anyone to get engaged in the topic. And you know, it's a decision for countries about whether they get involved with the ISO, because they need to have a national standards body and then make a decision about whether they're going to get involved in the standards. So.
Yeah, that's all good. Thank you.
So the next one is, what are your suggested actions really to engage with government and non-government agencies on this new ISO 55000? I think what people may be trying to get to is there a standard comms pack or something that people might be able to utilize to help engage on the standard? Because I think as people might say, the standards aren't always the most accessible thing in the world to be able to put in front of somebody, if you see what I mean, as a starting point.
Yes. Well, I do think, though, that it is one of the areas that can be put in front of people because of the different menus of actions and the different menus of public policy instruments. So it's very, for us, we wanted it to be quite practical, because that was the result of the survey that we undertook to be able to understand if it was going to be useful and whether we should go forward with the guidance document. And so I think it's full of practical, you know, issues and full of practical advice. I think it's the issue, though, is around getting that community of practice, community of interest, and where you are in that enabling environment, because it's around, I'm a member of the Institute of Public Works Engineers Australia, IPWEA, and in our asset management committee, we've looked at the disadvantage of remote regions and their the fact that their asset management is very constrained. So we've taken that to put forward, you know, what's the public policy that would support asset management within those remote regions, and how would that work? So there's smaller chunks of that you can look at, or there's other areas about, you know, what's big ticket items or big strategic view about infrastructure and priority of infrastructure, and taking that. Now, do you take that to government more generally? Do you take it to your local member? Do you take it to a conference forum? That's the strategic decisions and actions that you could probably start to coalesce around and look at. Are you a non-profit organisation that wants to advocate? Are you within a government agency, and what's that government agency, and what are the policy instruments available to you to be able to support good asset management? So I think it's about looking at where you're at, who is the community of interest, and who else is interested. Is it collaboration? Is it a cooperation around combined interests, and where are the strategic points? I'm a big believer in, you know, there's policy windows that open, and are you going to jump through that policy window while you've got the opportunity? So how does that work, and who's going to jump with you? So I think that, you know, those are strategic decisions that groups of people need to be making and moving forward on that.
Thank you. This question, did you get any kickback given the standard would elicit transparency of decision making? Did you get people push back in terms of they didn't necessarily feel the standard was the right way to go?
Did you want to take that, Tiffany, about some of the discussions that we've had? trying to get global consensus about this standard, has been an important task for us and a challenge to get the language right, to get the concepts right. And so I think, yeah, absolutely is not an easy road, but consensus model did prevail. But Tiffany might have some other comments to make about this, because I think it's an important issue.
Yeah, it was a good, and I think we've had a lot of challenging conversations around it. There's been a lot of debate, and it came down to the overall need that was expressed and also validated through surveys, in terms of the need for such a framework that would be an international standard, to have that type of gravitas and backing, not just from the global community, but also the amount of research and input that had gone into it. So it was many years of discussion in the making.
As all the international standards are, but I know you had some particularly unique sort of discussions and challenges. We will pick up the slides. I've already asked Tiffany and Kerry about that, and they'll make sure that we should be able to share something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you said that you're willing to take case studies from
Absolutely. Yeah.
from any group. So I think the answer to that question is yes. The case study on Portugal, I take it, is in the standard itself.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Correct. But it's also, we did an article on water, and there's a number of case studies there, 3 case studies in that. So if anyone's interested in the water example and how that played out for 3 case studies, it's available free. It's a publication that's an open publication in a water journal. Maybe we could share that.
Yep. Yeah. If you get that link across, I'll make sure that goes out in the email where we send out the recording. So that will be fantastic.
We're happy to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you been able to identify any potential synergies on the back of the standard? It's quite an open question, so that could be taken in a lot of different ways. But
yeah, I think when Tiffany mentioned about the South African case study, it was also mentored from one of the from the US, and I think that's the kind of synergy that's really important, that there's cross-pollination from those who have more mature asset management frameworks and more strategies to be able to work with those who are seeking that. And we found that in the states of Australia, that there's a lot of cross-pollination about what was going on. I'm in the state of Western Australia. You saw from the map how big that was. We are huge resources state of Australia, so it's quite rich in terms of its resource allocation across Australia, and what we were wanting to build our asset management. So in that sense, we put in place an infrastructure agency, an independent infrastructure agency, and we borrowed ideas from New South Wales because we saw that was one of the leading proponents and maturity in asset management. And so this cross-pollination happens as well. So it's really the networks and the learning environment in Victoria and New South Wales. Those communities of practice are really important. So and for ourselves, we learn from our work group because we have countries represented from various levels of maturity and various types of government. So using a common language, was really important to us to be able to understand what exactly we meant when we said public policy, what exactly we meant when we said enabling environment, because we had, you know, social democratic, we had liberal democratic, and we had not very democratic countries involved across our working group, and we needed to make it speak to everyone.
That's brilliant. I'm conscious that we've actually gone just past the top of the hour, so we've run out of time. But I wanted to say we've still got some questions, and what we'll do is we'll make sure we get those questions across to Tiffany and Kerry so that they can see them, and we'll think about whether there's a way to get them answered. Some of them I have tried to answer in the chat, so all the recordings, for example, of the previous briefings on the ISO documents are in the chat. I wanted to say a massive thank you to Tiffany and to Kerry for joining us. They've both joined us almost, well, quite a long distance apart in terms of time of the day. So massive, massive thank you for joining us. We've had people from across the world join us. Loads of really interesting questions. Thank you again. We will be making the recording available, and I will follow up with Tiffany and Kerry on seeing if we can make the slides available as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.